After coming back of a year of sabbatical. So tell us how that went. I know you spent some time in Europe, you started a podcast. Tell us about that whole experience.
Yeah, so the sabbatical allowed me to focus on a project that I've been wanting to do for a while, which is to interview several prominent computer scientists who are well known now in the computer science field, but they did not grow up in the US. They grew up in all other parts of the world, everywhere else. And so these are human interest stories where I interviewed them. These are called as oral history interviews. So essentially over the last year while I was in sabbatical, I interviewed 20 to 30 different computer scientists. We are on episode 43 of the podcast. The podcast is called Immigrant Computer Scientists, csimmigrant.org, or csimmigrant on all social media. It's available on Apple Podcasts and everything else. So that's kind of what I was doing over the last year. It was a very different experience for me. It was not as technical a work as I'm used to. It's not research, certainly.
Right.
It's not teaching. But it is technical in a different way because and it's an audio podcast, unlike this podcast where you have video, it's an audio podcast, and I'm particularly picky about how audio sounds.
So I could tell after listening to the episode.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time editing the episodes, ums and thus and things like that. I would edit those things out because I wanted it to be pristine. Partly because also the contents of that podcast are being archived by IEEE. As a part of this podcast project, so they have mirror pages of every web page that I set up for every episode. So that's part of the goal as well. So I wanted it to be really good, something that would hold up in posterity and would be useful for everyone listening to it. Along the way, I also did some travel, like you mentioned. I spent last fall semester 2021. I spent as a visiting faculty at UC Berkeley. And then past summer, I was a visiting faculty at Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Germany. I was supposed to spend a few more months in a few other places, but the pandemic got in the way, so I stayed put and focused on my episodes. So that was kind of what I did most of last year. It's very different. We were talking about this just before. There's a lot of interviews of technologists, engineers, about their work and about technology. But it's much rarer to find human interest interviews where you ask someone about, hey, how was it like growing up where you grew up? What was it like coming to this country? Was your English fine or was it different? Did you encounter or do you still encounter imposter syndrome? How do you deal with failures? I interviewed about half the episodes feature women computer scientists. And so I would ask them questions about, what was it like being a woman in your country doing computer science? And sometimes it would be like 70% of students in my batch in my country were women. I was like, wow, that's not the US at all. The US is like less than 20%, right? So there were surprises like that along the way. And that's partly why I did the podcast as well, to bring in different perspectives than we are used to here in this country, where every study we have here of diversity in computer science or in engineering is pretty much US focused, right? Actually, the idea for the podcast also started when I was reading this very famous book called Unlocking the Clubhouse. It's by two researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, Margolis and Fisher. And they wrote this book based on many interviews and surveys they did of undergrad students in computer science at Carnegie Mellon. And they asked them, what was it like growing up and, in your household and things like that. And I was reading this book. It was very, very interesting. And I was reading this because I was very interested in the diversity problem in engineering, where, we have less than 20% of our students are women in computing, and it's similar in other branches of discipline, in other branches of engineering. And the same thing, if you look at African Americans, Native Americans, all the underrepresented populations, they are really underrepresented. So, and that remains an unsolved problem in this country. So I was reading that book, and as I'm reading the book, I'm reading some of the anecdotes and the conclusions from the authors. And the conclusion and the anecdotes go something like, a large majority of male students grew up with computers in their home when they were growing up. And I'm sitting there thinking, that was not my experience growing up in India. And so I said, maybe I'm too old. Maybe it wasn't like that in the 80s or 90s when I was growing up. And so I asked some of the grad students in our department who came from other countries, like, did you have a computer at home? when did you encounter your first computer? When did you first write your first line of code? And many of them were like, college, work, things like that. And I was like, okay. So clearly the studies we have here are very much biased by the experiences of Americans, and a new perspective is needed where we bring in perspectives of how people came into engineering or science or computing or programming in their own countries. Right? So that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast. But along the way, we unearthed a lot of other things that people wanted to talk about as well. So it's been a very eye-revealing project to me because every single interview is very unique. Every person very different. I've interviewed like groups of people from the same country. Like every episode I do on a country, like we did an episode on Israel, and I interviewed 3 different Israeli-American computer scientists, and they all immigrated to the US at different times. Like one immigrated in the 70s, one in the 80s, and then one in the 90s. So very different decades, so very different experiences. And every one of them is, again, they have just very different reasons why they immigrated, why they stayed here. And even within an interview, like every 5 minutes, I would be surprised by something they say. Like I would ask a question, they would say something. I was like, okay, ditch that question. Let's go down this rabbit hole. Let's talk about this one, right? So that part was very, very exciting to me. So I really had I don't want to say fun because some of the stories are grim, others are funny, others are just like very different. But it was a very overall. I think I'm very glad I did that project. It was very different. I certainly knew that when I started it in fall 2021, a little over a year ago from now, I was asking myself, should I really do this? Like, this is way outside my comfort zone. First off, I don't know how to edit audio. I've never used Adobe Audition, or any of these other software before. And then second, I don't know how to interview people for human interest stories. So I went and watched, I read some journalism articles, but there's not a lot of stuff there that is accessible. And then I went and watched this very nice interview of Larry King, who's very well known as an interviewer. It was a very nice interview of Larry King done by someone else. I think the other guy was Sussman. I don't remember his first name. And in that, actually, he asked Larry King, like, what is your approach to doing interviews? I actually learned a lot from that. I think I listened to that episode a lot of times. I took a lot of notes from that. I think that helped me a lot. But then along the way, as the interviews kept going in my podcast, I kind of developed my own style. And so I enjoyed that a lot, which is why I love your show as well. You're doing human interest stories here, which again, I think need to be amplified more in the world.